The Brown versus Board of Education court case was a Supreme Court case in 1954. This was originally a court case that mainly focused on racial segregation in schools and fighting the final verdict of the Supreme Court cases prior, like Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, that ruled racial segregation and the separate but equal education policy in public schools to be allowed and legal. The giant effect that this court case had on children with disabilities is a lot less known than the effect it had on racial segregation. People started to recognize that students in special education were also being discriminated and had often been violated of their rights. Students were denied access to schools because of their disabilities, which parents argued was a huge violation of their civil rights. So parents of ELLs, English language learners, and students with disabilities now had a basis for the unequal treatment their children were experiencing in their schools, so they knew what was happening. They were made aware of the situation, so they could start arguing and advocating for their students, and students with disabilities were granted access into public schools to receive an education after this law was passed. Parents argued that submersion into the English classrooms for English language learner students and submersion into the standard classrooms for special education students wasn't beneficial for them and wouldn't help them be successful in the classroom. The Bilingual Education Act of 1968 is known as the first government commitment to acknowledge and help the needs of students that speak English as a second language or students who just have limited English speaking ability. This was signed by our president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson. This act helped introduce the Title VII policy, or the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, as it's also known as, into schools to ensure that students' needs were met with bilingual programs that would help them succeed in school. Funding was provided by the government to ensure that teachers had proper training for the programs, enough materials for lessons to teach in the programs, and so that the parents would know that their child's needs were met or being met and cared for and were confident in that. This act made parents believe that ethnic minorities can receive services for reasons other than racial segregation and discrimination, but parents and advocates would still argue there was still segregation and cultural discrimination issues in the classroom because of these programs that were supposed to fix that problem.
Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act was passed in 1973. Some key points from this act are that its purpose is to prevent discrimination against all students with disabilities. It ensures equal opportunity for all students in all activities. This act states that students not eligible for special education may be entitled to receive assistance to ensure academic success. And lastly, eligible students include students with learning problems, medical or health needs, such as severe asthma, and students with ADHD. For the implications, ELLs can be eligible through Section 504 to receive special help to achieve academic success. Students eligible through Section 504 receive special assistance and or accommodations without needing to be placed in a special education classroom. For the limitations, ELLs eligible through Section 504 are not provided with additional funds, such as funds provided by IDEA, and special educators must split time between 504 students and special education students, limiting their time between each. Section 504 of the Vocational
The Law versus Nichols Act was passed on January 21st, 1974. So in 1971, the San Francisco school system desegregated based on the result of the Supreme Court case Lee versus Johnson. So 2,856 Chinese students who were not fluent in English were integrated back into the San Francisco Unified School District, and Edward Steinman, a public interest lawyer, encouraged them to challenge the school district, and they filed a class action suit against Alan H. Nichols, the president of the SFUSD at the time, and other officials in the school district. One of the salient features of the new Lau consent decree in San Francisco is that it extends its terms to 5 schools within its district that serve detained and incarcerated students who are not English proficient. For the implications, it was aimed to make that school transition easier for young people who speak English as their second language. And this consent decree is the first to make it explicitly clear that the school district has the same legal obligations to its court-remanded students that it does for traditional school students. And for the limitations, even though the Bilingual Education Act was passed by Congress in 1968 to address the needs of limited English-speaking ability students, the funding was still very limited. Rios versus Reed of 1978. This court case was tried because of the parents of a Puerto Rican students in a district filing complaints that they believed that their children were being denied access to an equal learning opportunity in their education, like the other students that were English language learners. The students that were in these programs were getting taught in English, even though they struggled to understand and speak it, because there was a cultural barrier between the students and the teachers. The teachers were not getting the proper training to correctly teach the students what they needed to learn and how they needed to learn it. The court ruled in favor of the students and the parents and agreed that these programs and the school district were not doing their best for their students and weren't being held to a high enough standard. Now, teachers in these programs were required to have a proper training to help their students succeed. But after the ruling, the districts were still not required to teach in Spanish because they felt that this would still cause a segregation between the English language learners and the standard students in the classroom. Castaneda versus Pickard of 1981. This court case was sparked by a parent. The parent was Castaneda, and he was the father of the girl. He believed that his daughter was experiencing discrimination and exclusion of educational opportunities based on her ethnicity or her struggle with the English language and learning it, which he strongly felt that this was a violation of her rights as a student. Parents believed that the grouping in the school that were based on students' abilities was just another reason for the school to separate the Mexican American students that struggled with English and separate them from the other students that were in the standard classrooms. There was also a discovery within the school as a result from this court case that showed a lack of beneficial bilingual programs for students to properly develop their English so that every student in the school has an equal opportunity for success. The court originally ruled in favor of the public school and the school district because they didn't believe that there were any rights being violated in the school of the bilingual students. But the court eventually ruled in favor of Castaneda and all the parents of the students that felt like their rights were being violated. And they required the schools to follow guidelines to develop and improve their bilingual education programs.
The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in July of 1990. Some key points from this act are that it protects all individuals with disabilities from discrimination. It requires employers to make reasonable accommodations for disabled individuals. It does not directly deal with education, but it ensures accessibility for disabled people in buildings, transportation, workplace, etc. Also, this act ensures telecommunication companies accommodate for disabled individuals, such as people with hearing loss, speech impairment, and things like that. For the implications, this act does not directly connect with ELLs, but ADA does protect ELLs from discrimination and ensures employers and telecommunication companies accommodate for communication barriers. ADA protects from discrimination, as well as ensures accessibility in all public places for disabled individuals. ADA also requires that employers accommodate for all disabled people. For the limitations, ADA does not deal directly with education, which means it does not map out a specific guidelines for accommodating ELLs or special education students. The American
So the Proposition 227 Act was passed on June 2, 1998. This act required California public schools to teach LEP students that were in special classes that are taught nearly all in English. This also had the effect of eliminating bilingual classes in most of the cases. So this proposition was controversial because of its close proximity to heated political issues, including race, immigration, and poverty. So this act also required the state government to provide $50 million every year for 10 years for English classes for adults who promised to tutor LEP students. For the implications of the act, the bill's intention was to educate limited English proficiency students in a rapid one-year program. It also provided initial short-term placement, not normally exceeding 1 year, in intensive sheltered English immersion programs for children not fluent in English. And the limitations for this bill was the proposition would result in several fiscal impacts on the proposition in English, and the limitations for this bill was the proposition would result in several fiscal impacts on schools, and it also eliminated most programs in the state that provided multi-year special classes to LEP students by requiring that LEP students move from special classes to regular classes when they had acquired a good working knowledge of English, and two, these special classes are not normally last longer than 1 year.
The No Child Left Behind Act passed in 2001. Some key points from this act are that it reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It provides additional funding for students of low socioeconomic status. It requires all students to be tested annually in math and reading to prove adequate yearly progress. It increased federal regulation of state school systems, and it required teachers to meet higher standards for certification, and initially it increased test scores of minority students. For the implications, the No Child Left Behind Act provided funding for minority students, which resulted in increased test scores of minorities. Teachers came better equipped for special education due to the heightened standards for certification. For the limitations, the No Child Left Behind Act did not put emphasis on any subjects other than math and reading, and this forced teachers to teach for the test rather than teaching to educate.
For the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was passed on December 10, 2015, the purpose of this act was to replace and update the No Child Left Behind Act, which was signed into law in 2002. The purpose of this title was to provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education and to close educational achievement gaps. This was divided into 8 different titles, each emphasizing a different aspect of strengthening and supporting the educational systems of states and local educational agencies. This was important to remember that ESSA's precedenter, the No Child Left Behind Act, reinforced that students with disabilities are general education students first. The implications for this act was that states were required to adopt challenging academic standards. This could be the Common Core state standards, but doesn't have to be because of this act.
States will no longer have to do teacher evaluation through student outcomes as they did under NCLB waivers. And for the limitations of this act, it removed the stipulation for adequate yearly progress, and it does not stop the process of school closures in some communities, and it also keeps the federal government on the sidelines. For the Every